Hello, and welcome to the Real American Revolution, a multimedia program to discuss with noted authors and historians what really happened before, during, and after America's War for Independence. My name is Randy Flood, and today my guest is historian Woody Holton. Woody is currently professor of history at the University of South Carolina. After receiving his BA degree in English from the University of Virginia and his PhD in history from Duke University, Woody was an assistant professor, then full professor of history at the University of Richmond. He's the author of numerous books about the American Revolution period, including Abigail Adams, Black Americans in the Revolutionary Era, A Brief History with Documents, Unruly Americans and the Origins of the Constitution, and Forced Founders, Indians, Debtors, Slaves, and the Making of the American Revolution in Virginia. Woody's most recent book, Liberty is Sweet, The Hidden History of the American Revolution, has become a nationwide bestseller. So, Woody, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Randy. I'm so glad you do this. And I'm especially excited to also be involved now.
Well, we're happy to have you involved. Let's talk about Forced Founders, Indians, Debtors, Slaves, and the Making of the American Revolution in Virginia. First of all, what inspired you to write this book? And what's the main thesis of the book in a few sentences?
I was inspired by having two interests that didn't seem to overlap, but I discovered that they did. And those interests were in the traditional political history. The first chapter book that I read was given to me by my father. Many people watching know him. Linwood Holton was the first Republican governor of Virginia since Reconstruction. And he loved Thomas Jefferson. He gave me a biography of Jefferson. That was my first chapter book. So I was interested in the elites. And then I went off to grad school at Duke. And they weren't interested in the elites very much down there because they were discovering this whole new field that we call social history, the everyday lives of ordinary people. And I did get excited about that myself, but I never lost my interest in politics. So what about, might it be possible that ordinary people influenced the big events? I did. You asked about a thesis, and I can say it in one sentence. It is that not everything I tried out worked out, but I found several cases, and I'll give you an example in a second, but several cases where ordinary people really did have an impact on people like Jefferson and Washington. So, if you think of the Trumbull painting where they're presenting the Declaration of Independence to Congress, there's no poor people, there's no Indians, there's no women, there's no enslaved people there, but they did have an impact.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's for sure. Well, most Americans are taught or led to believe that taxation without representation was the cause of the American Revolution in Virginia and elsewhere. Nothing's ever mentioned in textbooks about land speculation, westward expansion into Native American lands in violation of the Proclamation of 1763, or the impact of the British Navigation Acts. They're never mentioned, much less American smuggling, all of which are important economic factors. Can you talk a little bit about these issues?
Sure. And that's one way. Another way to summarize my book is to say that it is more attuned to the economic history than some of the books that you can also read. But I would stress the other thing I said, which was because it's sort of just a different way of saying the same thing. And I think a more interesting way of saying it is that other people influence things. So let me finally give you a specific example: Native Americans. Anybody you can name, as you already mentioned, land speculation. Washington was one of the greatest land speculators there was one of my discoveries working on the book was that Thomas Jefferson was as well. And by the way, I apologize to you and everybody else listening for the clatter. I'm in the British Library in London, and they're setting up for some event there, but I can talk louder than anybody, so I'll beat them out. Anyway, so all these guys wanted Western land, and everybody remembers from high school that expression, westward expansion. But for westward expansion, for Native Americans, that meant westward retreat, and they didn't want to retreat. Their land was sacred to them, as many people would consider their home place sacred still today of different groups. And so they were determined to fight for their land, and they did in a bunch of wars. They often sided with the French because the French didn't want their land. The French wanted to trade with them and so forth.
Right.
And that all culminated in 1763 when Native Americans rebelled against the colonists. We call that Pontiac's Rebellion. And the British army put it down, but at great expense. And they'd also just incurred a huge expense at fighting the final war against France of the colonial era. And so the British government said, you know, we're sick of paying for these wars. We're going to draw a line along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains and say to Washington and Jefferson and actual settlers as well, you can't go past the mountains. We don't want you to take the Indians' land. And I have to be sure to tell you, Randy, that it's not out of any humanity that the British government was trying to protect the Indians. It was a very practical thing for them. War is the most expensive thing governments pay for. They were tired of paying for war. And so they said to the colonists, the way to prevent war against the Indians is to do right by them, to not take any more of their land. And that infuriated the colonists. And they mentioned Native Americans in their land 3 times in the Declaration of Independence. And actually, you mentioned taxation without representation. That's in there too, but that's in there only once. Although you asked about Forced Founders, and I'll tell you one thing that I didn't discover till long after writing Forced Founders. But if I ever do a supplement, this will be in it. And that is, I finally got around when I was writing a later book to reading the Stamp Act. I have to say, since I wasn't that interested in it for our first book, I didn't bother reading. It's like 20 pages. Finally did read it. And I had been taught, and I went on to teach my own students, oh yeah, the Stamp Act was all about getting the colonists to help pay for this big war that we call the French and Indian War. But that's not what it was for at all. It was for paying for this extraordinary decision the British government made at the end of that war in 1763 to leave 10,000 soldiers behind. You know, we always talk about leave no man behind. They deliberately left 10,000 behind, and that was for a very specific reason of guarding the proclamation line, of keeping the Indians and the colonists apart. And again, that was partly to prevent the Indians from coming in and attacking the colonists, but it was also there to prevent the colonists from attacking the Indians, because whenever you did that to the Indians, you got into a war with them. That's too much money. So I wrote an article. They didn't let me use the title I wanted, but my title would have been "No Indians, No Stamp Act." Had there been no Indians out there, there wouldn't have been a reason for this tax. And that was the first. There were a few other things the British had done before that, but that was the first real tax, and that's the one we all remember from high school, is the Stamp Act. And Native Americans played what I would consider a vital role, not only in that proclamation line, trying to protect their land, but in the adoption of the Stamp Act with its added grievance. You know, it would have been bad enough if the colonists had been represented in Parliament, but they weren't at all. And so they made a case that had been made ever since Magna Carta in 1215, no taxation without representation.
Well, you also mentioned the Navigation Acts in your book, and I've spent a lot of time looking at smuggling, and I've come to the conclusion that smuggling was America's first national pastime before football. Or baseball. And could you address the Navigation Acts? Nobody ever mentions that in the textbooks, but you know, it really is an underlying consideration for the causes. You know, when Americans are kind of left free, that they're prohibited from trading from any other nation in the world, because you know the crews have to be British, the ships have to be British, the prices are set in London, all that. Could you address that? The Navigation
Acts? Absolutely. The Navigation Acts reflected an attitude in Britain that the colonists are not there for us to create a religious refuge for Puritans who are tired of being oppressed, or for other people who are maybe in Ireland who are tired of paying a high rent to their landlords. The colonies are there to make Britain rich. And so it seemed logical to the British way back in the 1600s to adopt laws, as you said, giving themselves a monopoly of the American trade. But the Americans didn't think that was fair at all. And so they had no moral qualms whatsoever about violating that law. You know, it is kind of like the speed limit. It's what the sign says is not what people are doing on I-95. And so for years, the Americans just got away with violating the Navigation Acts, more up north actually than in the South, because it was easier to enforce against the South. These ships carrying tobacco have to, even if they're ultimately going to France, they got to check in Britain first and pay taxes, most of which are refunded. But the point was to make sure the profits of carrying that tobacco across the ocean go to British merchants. And that was one of the points that I think I added to the Navigation Act's debate was people tend to say mercantilism was to benefit the British nation. And it was, but it was also there to benefit the British merchants. So I really think it's important to put the merchants back in mercantilism because they were benefiting from it. And that makes them another, these groups I mentioned, Native Americans, but British merchants are another group who we don't usually think about when we think about why the Declaration of Independence was written, but they are right there. There's one of the complaints is against the king. He has cut off our trade with all parts of the world, and that's the Navigation Act. So Jefferson knew that he and his fellow Americans hated the British monopoly of their trade. We should know it too.
Absolutely. Excellent point. Yeah, you might want to adjust your screen just a little tad there.
Say that again.
Can you adjust your screen?
My screen.
There
Sorry.
you go. There you go. You're in good shape. Okay, there. Well, Americans also led to believe that the landed gentry, the people that everyone respected, the wealthy men like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry, led us directly, they were the leaders who led us into America's war for independence. But you say in your book, however, that it's the not so famous groups that helped influence the American Revolution. Can you offer some examples? For example, the American Revolution perhaps was influenced by others, as you mentioned, Native Americans, small farmers, those in debt, African American. Could you expound on each one of those?
Sure. Well, we talked about Native Americans, and I'll get to African Americans in a second because I think their real influence started a little later. That is in 1774. But earlier than that, it's small farmers who, if you were dividing up the population, the single largest group in the population would be enslaved people because they were 40% of the people, and then the 60% who were white where some were tenants and some were big landowners and some were merchants and artisans and all that group. So we definitely want to talk about African Americans since they were the largest group. But small farmers were the second largest group, and they're worth talking about as well. And you mentioned these debts. And historians are still arguing whether we should see these debts as kind of decadence. If I run up my credit card buying fancy clothes, then you go, well, whatever happens to you now, you deserve it because you were irresponsible. That's one kind of debt. But there's another kind of debt, which is investment. You got to borrow money to get your business off the ground. And the Virginians did justify that that's what they're doing. Unfortunately, by our modern standards, often the business was growing tobacco, and usually that meant buying enslaved or trafficked Africans. But my point about small farmers is that they did fall deep in debt to British merchants. And there's very few debtors in the world who love their creditors. I don't like the people that I pay my mortgage to once a month, although I pay it, or my credit card company or anybody, but they really hate it. And partly there was sort of an ethnic thing to it, because a lot of these traders that they, Traders, that they owed money to, they also saw as traders spelled the other way because they were Scottish. And the Scots had, in fact, rebelled in 1715 and 1745, or most of them had. And I'm in England right now. I would never refer to myself as being in England if I were up in Glasgow. In fact, I even referred to that as Britain, and they said, "You're not in Britain anymore, son. You're in Scotland." And those tensions were even worse. I mean, sort of what, I'm glad people are aware. It's too bad the reasons that we're aware of it, but I'm glad people are becoming more aware of lingering anti-Semitism, and it's a terrible thing that's still with us. But it helps us understand the anti-Scottish thing too, because that was sort of an ethnic difference. It was a religious difference, that is Anglicans in England versus Presbyterians like my family up in Scotland, and an economic difference, because it's true that a lot of the merchants were Scottish, just as the anti-Semitic trope has Jews out to be all merchants, although of course they aren't, never were. But anyway, there was this prejudice against Scott. People hated owing the money to the Scots. And that all came to a head when a terrible recession hit in 1772, and the price of tobacco just plummeted. And people, we've often heard of farmers today having to sell their crop for less than that it cost them to grow it. They're making negative profits. And that was happening in 72, all because the price of tobacco was so low. And so some of these small farmers got together and had a clever idea, which I call it OTEC. You remember OPEC was the Organization of Petroleum Exporting States. Well, this is OTEC, the Organization of Tobacco Exporting Colonists, because what they did was hold their tobacco back from the market, trying to drive up the price. And it spread. It had to spread to work, because it doesn't work if it's just a local thing. It has to really cover the whole Chesapeake. But it was hard to make it work, and it also looked like they were just trying to skate out of their debts, which no one's going to lend you money in the future if that's the reputation you get. And there was always the danger of being sued. But then here's where something very clever happened. And here's where the gentry, the Lees, one of the most famous families in Virginia, took over. And they said, well, why don't we merge this economic movement where small farmers are trying to hold their tobacco back from the market, merge that with a patriotic movement to pressure Britain to repeal all those bad laws they adopted against Parliament. They adopted a ton of bad laws, as the colonists saw it, in early 1774. None of them hurt Virginia at all. And it wasn't clear that Virginia was going to sympathize with Massachusetts. As with England and Scotland, they had religious differences. Virginia did with Massachusetts, and other differences with Massachusetts. They saw them as ghosts, the way a lot of people still do maybe today. And so those Virginians, it wasn't clear they were going to sympathize with Massachusetts, but the Lees were the ones who were smart enough to show Virginians it's in your economic interest to show support for the people up in New England, because you can withhold your tobacco and stop saying you're doing it for economic reasons and start saying you're doing it for patriotic reasons. That is, we're trying to stick it to the British merchants to force them to pressure Parliament to repeal all those anti-Massachusetts laws. And that's what they did. With one important change to what Massachusetts was asking Virginia, stop all exports right away. And the Virginians said, well, we can't quite do that because we've just taken a crop out of the ground. Let us export this crop. Give us a year to do that. It took about a year for the whole process. Let us export this crop, and then we'll stop sending tobacco. And what that promise of an export ban coming in 1 year, what that did was the merchants drove the prices of tobacco sky high. So it went from down in the basement to up in the penthouse, the price of tobacco did. And people had been holding this tobacco, in some cases back for 3 years. It keeps okay for 3 years. And they flooded the market with this tobacco. And so it's almost like Adam Smith would write Wealth of Nations in 1776 saying, as the price goes up, people buy less. But no, the price was going up and people were buying more because the merchants in Britain and in the continent, on the European continent, were trying to stock up on tobacco in order to be ready for what might be 7 lean years. And then, in fact, that's what it turned out to be, 7 lean years when they couldn't import tobacco. So the colonists made a killing, and many of them paid off their debts just with that one crop, because the price was so high and the quantity was so high. Price times quality, quantity equals a huge profit. So I haven't tried to explain that to many people. It take like 50 pages to do it in the book, but that's the short version. And to me, it's the most interesting way in which small farmers do things.
Absolutely. Now, you also mentioned African Americans, how they've played a much greater role than people ever visualize or read about. And could you address that in terms of how that particular group influenced the American Revolution?
Right. 40% of Virginians were enslaved by other Virginians. But ironically, it was up in Massachusetts where only about 5% or fewer of the people were enslaved. It was there that we get the first reports of overtures from African Americans to British officials. Now, we need to remember there were white loyalists in the South Carolina backcountry where I live today, out on Long Island and other places. There were white loyalists, but there were hardly any white loyalists in Massachusetts. and hardly any in Virginia. And so in Massachusetts, Abigail Adams, who you and I are going to talk about someday, she was the first to report there in September of 1774. She heard a rumor. She didn't say where she picked it up, but what she heard was that some slaves had gotten together, chosen somebody to speak to a British officer about, look, here in Massachusetts, it's fall of 1774, Lexington and Concord, none of that has happened, but they can kind of see over the horizon. These enslaved people can. I was taught, as you probably were back in the 60s, that slaves were ignorant, but these people were not ignorant at all. They could see what was coming. They could see a war was coming between the British government and the vast majority of white Americans. So these African Americans go to the British and say, put us to work. And the governor of Massachusetts was also the commander in chief of British forces in America, Thomas Gage. He was intrigued. He gave it to one of his assistants, but never really acted on it. But a couple months later, in November of 74, James Madison is in his home in what's now Madison County, or next to Madison County, Orange County it was, Virginia and the Piedmont, and he turns in a report very similar to the one that Abigail Adams said. Like it says on Amtrak, or we've got it here on the trains in Britain. If you see something, say something. The line over here is, see something, say something, and we'll sort it. They love saying we'll sort it. So both Abigail reported it to her husband, Madison reported it to his friend in Philadelphia. And then there start to be other reports in April of 1775 of African Americans. The word I keep coming to is overtures. They're reaching out to the British saying, you may not like us, and we don't really like you because you've participated in enslaving us all these years. But if you will free us and give us muskets, we will fight on the British government side. And by the end of the war, just to skip ahead a little bit, something like 10,000 did fight on the British side. And the British government did something it doesn't always do, which is it kept the promise and did free those who had survived, who were a minority of those who fought on their side. And they settled mostly in Nova Scotia after the war. They have an amazing subsequent to the war story. But to go back in time to 1775, when Governor Dunmore, who was the last royal governor of Virginia, he'd gotten all these overtures from African Americans, and he was the first to say officially, yes, I'll take you up on that offer. And he issued an Emancipation Proclamation, not that different from Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, limited, just like Lincoln's was, and only extended to the slaves owned by rebels, in Lincoln's case, in the rebel areas. And but he did issue it, and thousands of slaves joined in those first couple of years, unofficially in other states, but officially in Virginia. They have a deal with the British. And then where this all ends up was Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence, and the final grievance, in those days, they saved the best for last. The final grievance was also the longest grievance, and the only one where he accused the king of being a bad Christian, the only one where he fell back on that sort of fallback thing that you do if you're an amateur writer, and Jefferson was no amateur, but we know it from tweets, all caps. He called the king, he was talking about, these are men that were, and of course he was talking about African Americans. He called the king a bad Christian. It was the most passionate by far of all the complaints, the longest by far of the complaints. It was all about slavery, where he first blamed the king for the fact that he had slaves, which is kind of shady. We could talk about that, but also sort of the culmination of this culminating grievance was, and now you're getting these slaves to kill us, slaveholders. And that is sort of the final argument for independence in the eyes of somebody like Jefferson, and I think in the eyes of many enslaved, like William Byrd III. He was prepared to fight for the king, but he switched sides and offered to fight for the colonists, as one of his sons did, as a patriot, after the governor of Virginia shook hands with the slaves and made that deal. Archibald Carey from Chesterfield County, Virginia, described it as they're aiming a dagger at our throats through the hands of our slaves. Whites were furious. And so all these other grievances were important too, the ones we've talked about, lots that we haven't had time to talk about. But this appeal to the slaves is really what pushed a lot of the white people over the edge into wanting to declare independence. But I made the mistake that everyone makes, and I just made it myself. I called it an appeal to the slaves. If you follow the chronology I just laid down, it was blacks who were making overtures to the British for more than a year before the British finally took them up on their offer. So this fits in the same bucket that I've been talking about, how Native Americans and small farmers and British merchants who you raised, and now African Americans, these are all groups that we don't think of when we think of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. On August 2nd of 1776, they adopted it 2 months earlier. We don't think about these groups when we think about the Declaration of Independence, but we should, because collectively, in pursuing their own interests or their own freedom, in the case of enslaved people, they did things that had effects, and one of those effects was to help get the whites even angrier against the crown.
Excellent. Well, I have a little tag-on question for that. A lot of people do know and recognize Dunmore's proclamation, but sometimes, they forget that there was also another far-sweeping proclamation, and that's the Phillipsburg Proclamation of Sir Henry Clinton, which went further than Dunmore's proclamation. Could you talk about that just a little bit, and also explain the impact on Virginia and how that amplified Dunmore's proclamation?
Sure. Yeah, it's a sort of a strange document in that it was issued. It was the tone was sort of unfriendly to blacks. It starts off with threats against blacks if they fight on the American side, but says, on the other hand, if you'll fight on our British side, then or you'll just come over to our side, that you're free to work in any position you want. So it was a true Emancipation Proclamation in that sense. It was a true proclamation in another sense too, was that there was no deal being offered. They didn't say, if you will fight for us, then we'll free you. It just says, just come to the territories we control, and you'll be free. And most importantly, it was a true emancipation. It was a true Emancipation Proclamation in that it was extended to women as well as men. Now, Dunmore's proclamation, lots of women and children even took Governor Dunmore up on his offer, even though it was only extended. The line was, if you have to be able and willing to bear arms. And he meant men, but women were willing. They may not have been able at the time, because not many women, black or white, had a lot of experience fighting, but they learned quick. And actually they served in other ways, and he kept the promise to women as well as men. So yes, the 1779 Phillipsburg Proclamation, which I'm glad you know about it, because you're right, almost nobody does, Benedict Arnold switched to the British side, and he came down here in 1779, I think it was. And there were a bunch of expeditions to Virginia, culminating, of course, in Cornwallis's in 1781. In all of those cases, African Americans flocked to the British, and some escaped with the British. Tragically, the real tragedy of Yorktown, and you have to be able to see two things at once. That's why I've got two eyes. You have to be able to see two things at once. Yorktown was a great victory for the French, who produced most of it, and the Americans, who benefited the most from it. But it was also a great tragedy for all these hundreds of African Americans who joined the British and either died of smallpox, because they had a smallpox epidemic during the run up to Yorktown's surrender, and it was a tragedy for those who were re-enslaved as well.
Yeah, a lot of them were set free in the no man's land between the British fortifications and the American and French artillery, and they're free. They feel they're in a safe haven with the British, and then Cornwallis turns them loose in the no man's land, because he doesn't want the spread of smallpox to infect everybody, and he can't feed them because he's got a limited amount of resources and everything. And that really is a tragedy, It is. All those who died.
He had one job, and that was to win the war. And when African Americans, being on his side, helped him win the war, then he was all about having them. And he still had some after. He had a great spy who turned out to be spying on him for the British, for the Americans. but you're absolutely right. They showed their true colors, so to speak, when they treated blacks just as poorly as Southern whites did when it was not in their interest
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
do so. And it's worth mentioning here that I said something like 10,000 blacks got free by fighting on the British side. Something like 10,000 up north got free by fighting on the American side. And the great historian Benjamin Quarles made a wonderful point, I think, that
Yeah.
African Americans, they weren't fighting for the British, they weren't fighting for the Americans, they were fighting for the principle. That principle was freedom.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, one of the things that I love about your book is you really focus, unlike a lot of other individuals, on 1774. And you say in your book that that was a very pivotal year on Virginia's road to revolution, but it was also on the road to revolution in several of the other colonies as well. Could you talk about that? The importance of
Yes.
1774.
Yes. Well, I'm grateful since this is the 250th anniversary of 1774, and in some ways, I'd say 1774 is a more important year than 1776 because over those next 2 years between 1774 and 1776, that's when the cake was really baked. Those last few months of before July 2nd, when they declared independence, it was just a matter of bringing along a few stragglers. And New York was still straggling after July 2nd, although they joined in time to sign the document on August 2nd, 1776. So why do I think 1774 is so important? Because that's the beginning of the end. Up until 1774, certainly at the start of that year, it's the British who are mad on, say, January 1st, 1774, because Bostonians have just dumped tea into their harbor. But it's still a dispute between Boston and Britain. The other colonies were pretty disengaged from things. But then the British adopted all these laws punishing Boston and Massachusetts generally for the Tea Party. And the Lees come up with this great idea of, well, we can engage Virginia in this by boycotting trade. I mentioned non-exportation, withholding tobacco, but the Virginians also withheld their imports from the Virginians stopped buying stuff from the British as well. So all of that's going on in 1774. And also it was in the fall of 1774 that African Americans launched their first real initiative to the British. And so that's insane. It didn't all happen in 1774, but the process began of changing the colonists. I would call the colonists restorationists up till 1774, to use that loaded term from the previous century. The colonists were just trying to turn back the clock to the way things had been up until 1762. They were pretty happy, despite the Navigation Acts. They didn't like the Navigation Acts, but at least the British weren't trying to tax them as well.
Right.
So I think they could have lived with it. White colonists could have until 1762. And all they were trying to do was restore that status quo of 1762, right up until 1774, when things started to happen, really culminating in the north with Lexington conquered, culminating in the north with in the south, culminating with Dunmore's proclamation. Those things both happened in 75, but we were kind of on the slippery road to that by the end of 1774. So that's why I think it's the pivotal year.
Interesting. I certainly agree with you on that. No question about it. Well, Woody, for viewers and listeners, what's the big message that you want them to take away from Force Founders? The major thing you want anyone who reads the book to remember.
That the revolution was a lot more exciting than we've ever given it credit for. Talking not about the war now. My book doesn't go into the war. I and lots of other people have written other books about the war, but because actually stopped in 1776 when the war was just getting off the ground. But the road to revolution is a lot more exciting than we realize. In school, you and I were forced to read certain documents, and it was, I'm glad I was forced to read John Locke, and because he is certainly a progenitor of the American Revolution. And those documents, the last thing I would want to say, the documents are unimportant. They are important. But if you have the documents plus Native Americans and African Americans and British merchants who are just trying to make a living, sometimes by trafficking in Africans over and turning them into African Americans, and African Americans themselves. It's a much more interesting story than if you can say documents plus people.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, certainly. Well, Woody, thanks so much for joining me today. Really great to have you. And to our viewers and listeners, I've been talking with historian Woody Holton, author of Forced Founders, Indians, Debtors, Slaves, and the Making of the American Revolution in Virginia. An excellent book available certainly on Amazon and on Abe Books as well. My name is Randy Flood. Join us again next time for another exciting interview with an outstanding historian on the real American Revolution. So long for now.